EyeCan Alliance is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping the visually impaired become and stay active while building communities for blind and vision-impaired individuals to support them and their families in athletic events. To get notified and not miss an episode, please like and subscribe to hear the history of EyeCan as well as the people who have helped the organization and the athletes.
Justin Sternberg here with us today. And Justin, the way my description of Justin is the single person that has more time with Brandon, either running on a tether or riding on a tandem, or swimming, not necessarily, probably swimming too, than I have. And so he's intimately familiar with Brandon and all the pluses and minuses thereof. But it's great to have you here, Justin, and thanks for taking time out of the day. Again, we always are talking to and celebrating in the Adame household. We're always celebrating the guides. The guides are the heroes in on our planet, because we understand and we realize that they give up time, energy, effort, and in some cases treasure to come and guide Brandon. And so you're sowing not just into Brandon's life, you're sowing into our family's life. And it was that people like you and what you've done is really the impetus on how EyeCan came into being, was our way to try and give back to the community that's been really great for us. And that's the idea of giving other blind, vision impaired athletes a chance to participate in athletics, whatever type of athletics it might be.
Right.
And so, welcome.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk about, guiding, right? I always say it's all about the athlete, and you know that. I am probably your biggest thorn when it comes to, look, it's his race. It's not my race, right? I mean, you hear me say that all the time, is I'm not going to influence his race. I will help him. I will guide him. I will be his eyes. I will keep him from falling in a manhole, tripping over a curb, falling over a crack. But ultimately, it's his race, because at the end of the day, we are the same way, right? I want them to accomplish their race. Just like if I was racing, I want to accomplish my race. With that said, I always love the fact when people tell us we can't, right? I think the word can't always comes up, right? I talk to people all the time, and they hear that I guide, and I'm like, yeah, they're like, well, how is that even possible, right? How is a blind or a visually impaired athlete going to run 26.2 miles or swim, 2.4 miles or get on a bike, for crying out loud? They don't understand the concept of getting on a tandem bike and riding and how that ultimately works. And when I talk to them, they're like, oh my God, that's really amazing. And I said, it's not amazing. Why? Because they can do anything you can do. They just need that one thing, which is my eyes, right, to get them across. My feet aren't running for them. My legs aren't running for them. My arms aren't swimming for them. At the end of the day, it's just me and him, and we're basically doing what I would do if I was running or swimming or biking, right? At the end of the day. And I love the fact that there's organizations out there that allow the opportunity for this to happen. Because for the longest time, it's just like, no way. We're not going to take the liability. We're not going to do this. But that's changed tremendously since we jumped on in 2011.
So you mentioned 2011. Brandon's first half marathon was 2006.
Yep.
And so Marilynn and I and Mary Lowe, she was originally Mary Duvall, were his guides. And she jumped in and said, hey, listen, I'll guide Brandon. And Marilynn said yes. And then subsequent to that, after a couple of years, 2010, we meet Matt Miller with the See Different organization, and he says, I think Brandon can do an Ironman or a triathlon. And that preceded 5 minutes before Brandon says, I'll give it a shot. And I think mainly because it was in the Woodlands. So Brandon had a degree of comfort that it was close to home, and maybe there was he's safe there. He doesn't have to venture way out. And so he says yes, and then I spend the next 45 minutes using various versions of the English language to describe where Brandon is in his swimming prowess, in his cycling prowess, and in his running prowess. And ultimately, the one that was easy was, run a marathon. We'd been running several halves. We already knew what it took to run a half. And we knew what it took to train and run a half and be able to walk afterwards and have a normal life, as opposed to be all stiff and couldn't hardly move for the next 3 or 4 days. Or
Right.
heaven forbid you had to go downstairs.
Yep.
We knew what to do so that we could enjoy it. And so then the idea of investing the time to do a full marathon never occurred to Marilynn and I, and subsequently never occurred to Brandon, because we knew what we had to do the half. And here comes somebody that says, not go do a marathon. No, the marathon is the toss at the end of swimming 2.4 miles, riding a bike 112, and marathon. Geez, aren't you lucky? You get to run a marathon at the end.
Right.
So it was quite an adventure. And so, we all have different versions. And so, Justin, tell me, how did you actually come in contact with us, and what was that first thing like? Because, it's been a few years.
Yep.
And as time is, we kind of relish the story, or we forget pieces, and we have our own version. What's your version of your first introduction to Brandon and the Adame family?
My first introduction to Brandon is I was looking for a story. As many know, that I've worked in TV for 20 plus years, and I was working at Channel 13 at the time, and I got into kind of running and stuff like that, but I always covered the marathon. The marathon was kind of my thing. I just liked covering it, and I was always looking for stories, right? So I watched the Ironman broadcast from the World Championships on NBC, and I basically said, there's a blind athlete, a blind grandfather running the Ironman, and his name was Charlie Plasko. And I walked up to my wife after watching that, and I said, what's my excuse, right? A blind athlete just ran the Ironman, so why wouldn't that be possible for anybody else? What's my excuse for not doing it? So I went back to work the next day, and I called my contact over at the marathon. I said, just out of curiosity, do you have any visually impaired or blind athletes that you have signed up to run the marathon? And he said, yeah, we have this one guy. Give me a few minutes. Let me call you back. Called me back, gave me the name Brandon Adame and a phone number. So I pick up the phone. I called Brandon. Brandon answered the phone, and it's like the first conversation was, "Oh yeah, I want to do something. I want to do it." And I said, "Okay." And I didn't really know how old he was. I didn't know if he was an adult or any of that type of stuff. So I said, "Okay." He kept on mentioning his dad, and I said, "Okay, have your dad give me a buzz. Let's have a conversation. Here's my phone number." And he wrote it down. And I guess within an hour or so, David Adame calls me back and goes, "Hey, how'd you get our number?" And I said, well, I reached out to the marathon. They knew about you guys, and they told me that you had been running the half marathon over the years. And I said, great, I want to do a story. So we met at Memorial Park 2 days later, and we sat there on a bench. And I had the conversation with Brandon. This first time I met Brandon. And I talked to Brandon about running the half marathon and what it takes and the training he does and his guide and everything else. And the beauty of it is he goes, "Oh yeah, my guides, I just hold on to my guides and we run." And then I go, "Well, have you ever thought about doing a triathlon?" Keep in mind, in this process, I had reached out to See Different founder Matt Miller. And Matt Miller was the guy that kind of connected the dots, right? And he just so happened to be from Sugar Land too. So he was from Houston. So we kind of connected and stuff like that. And he kind of got me on this triathlon kick. You can do the triathlon. We could do this type of stuff. So I said, have you ever thought about doing a triathlon, Brandon? And he looked at me and goes, no. I said, are you curious? Would you ever do it? No. He was not going to do it if his life depended on it. He kept on telling me no.
And really, probably he kept telling you no, but he didn't really know what he's saying no to.
Right.
He probably wasn't even sure at that point that there's swimming, biking, and running,
Right.
and all those kinds of things.
And fast forward, y'all had the conversation. We connect with Matt Miller and everything else. He's like, yeah, you can do this. What I love about this story, though, is the fact that there was not an opportunity to say no. Right? You had people around you at the time that were believing that Brandon could do something. And I think that's kind of the spur in all this is basically the push forward to take Brandon from running a half marathon with his hand on somebody's shoulder to being able to put a tether on his arm, to be able to swim in an open water situation, and to bike on a tandem bike. The belief behind it is what always gets me. It's like the belief that you can do something and can't is not an option. And I think that's once you had that surrounding of people saying we can, you started seeing people like Nigel and Trini come forward. You had Ron Stent, you had myself, you had this whole list of people.
Patty Godfrey
believing in these people. And that to me is like the inspiration behind ultimately what EyeCan stands for, right? In the grand scheme of things is the fact that yes, you have a disability. You have a disadvantage when it comes to doing something, but it's nothing you can't overcome. And we're going to figure this out and we're going to make it happen. And guess what? At the end of the day, in 2011, when we ran that Ironman, Brandon came across the finish line. Charlie came across the finish line as Ironman. And everybody looked around and said, the impossible was done. And I always look at them and say, nope, not impossible. Impossible is not a word. Because anything is possible if you put your mind to it. So I use that impossible line or can't very, very loosely with this.
So you mentioned Charlie, and so we don't want that to be a throwaway name in the middle of this.
Right.
And you mentioned they came across, but you didn't. So what isn't clear, I know because I know the story, but what isn't clear to everybody listening is that you were Charlie's guide.
Yes.
For that. And I'm going to put one thing out there, and that is you'd never done an Ironman. And so take us back to you met us, and at that point in time, you talked to Brandon. Mm-hmm. You had the idea to ask him about a triathlon, which wasn't on anybody's radar, including ours at that particular point. Or no, we had just explored that idea.
Yep.
And Brandon told you no, right?
Yep.
But the whole reason we were doing the marathon that year was because we were going from the half marathon to marathon distance to kind of see where Brandon was to try and be ready. This is January.
Yep.
To then try and be ready for an Ironman 4 or 5 months later.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get back. So now, again, true David Adame fashion, we kind of went sideways. Let's talk about Charlie Plascon and back that up a little bit.
So it goes back to when we connected with Matt Miller and See Different. Matt guided Charlie through the Ironman that I watched. And that
was on TV.
That was on TV.
Kona.
Yep, Kona, NBC. It was Charlie was a grandfather, and his grandkids were there at the finish line when he finished. And I always said, like I told my wife, I said, if he can do it, why can't I? So we're like, this was the guy. Charlie Plascon was the guy that inspired me to say, you know what? I'm going to run the Ironman one day. Did I know when? No. But with that said, Matt connected us. He came in to do the 30K that was out in Sugar Land, which is a prep race for the marathon in January. Brandon was out there. We were all out there. And Matt asked me to guide Charlie. He said, do you want to guide just so you could figure out, when you tell your story, you kind of have an inside glimpse of what. And I'll tell you what. That was the most fun I've ever had was guiding Charlie on that 30K because we sat there and talked the entire time and just had a great conversation. We really got to know each other over 18 plus miles, right? I mean, it was just a lot of fun. So we crossed the finish line. Charlie goes on his way. I go on my way. Didn't think anything of it. I was still training for triathlon. I was still training for the marathon. I was, hoping to qualify for Boston at the time. Nothing planned in the near future. I knew the Ironman was kicking off in the Woodlands that year. I knew it was his inaugural year. I wanted to do it, but I didn't know, and there was a lot of questions around the how, right? So anyway, so let's fast forward here.
Well, no, before we fast forward, do you remember what year this was?
It was 2010.
2010.
Yeah,
so this is early December of 2010
Yes.
is when the 30K
When
was.
the 30K was.
And just to interject, that was when Brandon, we'd run like 11 or 12 miles because remember
Right.
we're training we originally were training for the half.
Right.
We're just now starting to come to the realization, and so now Matt Miller says, "Oh, listen, here's a great, you're going to do the half. Here's a build-up race. It's a 30K, 18.1 miles, I think is what it is." And so Brandon turns and goes from one weekend running 11 miles to then running 18 point something miles.
Yep.
A distance he'd never ever run before, and a step up of over 5 miles.
Right.
So, unbeknownst in my memory, I don't even remember you being in that race and Charlie being there.
Yeah.
I remember Brandon being the very last guy to
Right.
finish the race 20 minutes after the race ended because
Right.
it had a cutoff at 4 o'clock.
Right.
And the police and all the crowd being there to cheer Brandon on,
Right.
because he was the last one, and they didn't close the course on him. They let him finish in 4 hours and 20 minutes. And our immediate thing wasn't, oh, yeah, great, what a great accomplishment. Our immediate thing was, holy geez, I don't know if we can finish in a marathon in a couple months under 6 hours. How's that going to happen? But again, so now you're there,
Right.
And you're in the crowd with us, and we're around the same planet, right? And that kind of thing, but we're not bumping into each other yet.
No.
And we do know Matt. We'd been introduced to Matt. You had conversations with Matt. You're running the race. Brandon's running the race. And this is December of 2010.
Right.
And we're on this path of collision. And so go from there.
So we at that point, we just kind of go on our way. We do everything is leading up towards the marathon. I'm running the marathon on my own at that point. And I think if I recall, because I did the story with Brandon for the marathon, it aired during the marathon. I was producing the post show for the marathon. I believe that I was at the finish line when Brandon crossed to get a quick interview with Brandon or yourself or his guides at some point, just to do an update in that 10 p.m. newscast or that 10 p.m. finish line show. And so he finished that race, and that was, like you said, it was all preps at that point for Ironman. We were all going for Ironman. Again, I still wasn't in the mix for Ironman. I wasn't guiding. I wasn't running. I wasn't doing anything. I was just training on my own.
Training on your own. At that point, you weren't even really signed up to do Ironman.
Nope.
You were just in your mind mentally preparing yourself for the penultimate triathlon, an Ironman. But you weren't lined up yet.
My focus at that point in time was Boston. I qualified for Boston. My focus was I'm going to run Boston in April, and then I would be done for the year. So January, I'd run Boston and then keep going. And it just so happened, fast forward, like all this training, Brandon had done it. I hadn't been involved. I knew about it. I had followed Brandon's story and his journey through this type of stuff. And I had been at other races, right? There was several prep races, whether they were triathlons or whatever. At that point, I really wasn't involved with Brandon at that point.
So again, kind of backing up the calendar as we put the Justin Sternberg pieces together of the story. Do you remember being at Andy Stewart's sprint try that was, I want to say, early October, late September?
Yep.
So that was Brandon's very first triathlon.
Yep.
Only a couple weeks after we had decided to go on this journey.
Right.
And I think one of the things that really got Brandon going was the fact that Andy, bless his soul and his graciousness, he got on the microphone. It was his race.
Right.
And he said, hey, we got this kid doing his first ever triathlon.
Yep.
And he can't see a thing.
Right.
And all the crowd, clapping for him and all that. And that was Brandon's first entree into having response from everybody. We'd done the half Ironmans, but they're pretty much just not half Ironmans. half marathons.
Right.
But it was just us.
Right.
And, you might hear somebody holler or clap or a little bit. But
Right.
again, remember the early ones is there wasn't a tether. There wasn't
No.
a visible display.
Right.
We didn't wear a shirt that said, this guy's blind. He just
Right.
had his hand on our shoulder.
Right.
On my or Marilyn's shoulder as we guided him. And so there was some reaction, but this first time where
Right.
the whole crowd is 600-700 people, 800 people, all clapping, cheering him on. He hadn't done anything yet.
Do you remember if that was the pool swim or lake swim?
That was lake.
That was lake
The
swim.
summer was the pool.
Right.
And the winter time was the duck pond.
Gotcha. So rewind just a little bit.
All right.
My first triathlon was the pool swim that was earlier that year.
Yeah,
That was the
like
first time
3
I
or
ever
4
did.
months earlier.
Yeah, that was the first time I had ever done a triathlon. And in fact, I was on a road bike. I was, I found a pair of bike shorts or something. Like I had never done anything to that point when it came down to it. So when I got to that lake swim for that next one, I was prepared. At that point, I was like, I'm all in. I'm going to do this type of
Oh,
stuff.
no. So what you're telling me is you went from a road bike. Now, the unknowledgeable would go like, well, aren't all bikes road bikes?
No, I
No?
went from a road bike to what they call a triathlon bike, and I that was begging and pleading with the wife to let me buy a bike and spend all this money
Thank
and
you for
everything
that.
else.
I didn't want to bring that up, but that's how
But that's what my whole life is, right?
That means you invested money.
into a sport that I made my lifestyle. I mean, for a long, long time, marathon, triathlon became a huge, huge part of my life, right? And my family's
Which
life.
the Adames appreciate, by the way.
And then when we got to that race, I remember that race. I remember Brandon because I knew Brandon, right? I had interviewed him. I'd done the story with him at that point in time. So I knew Brandon. So I was cheering Brandon. I'd walk up to Brandon and, pat him on the back and say, hey, have a good race. I'll see you at the end, that type of stuff. So I was always real excited. But at that point, I haven't guided. We get to the 30K. I guide Charlie. We kind of go on our own a little bit. I knew at that point I was going to run the marathon. The 30K was the last race before the marathon in January. We kind of move on. I still am training for triathlon as I'm training for the Boston Marathon. I'm getting faster. I'm getting better. Everything else. I wanted to guide. I knew I wanted to guide, but there really wasn't the opportunity to guide until after, the marathon at that point. Everybody was doing what they were going to do. And I was
Puzzle
just kind of
pieces.
there.
These are all puzzle
they're
pieces.
They're just all puzzle pieces. So when I got to, I knew that the Ironman was happening in May. I had done a story on it. In fact, that was I was like, oh, cool, the marathon or the Ironman's coming. I'm so stoked about this race, but I don't think I was gutsy enough, or I was too cheap to purchase a bib for it at the point in time. I'm going to go with the latter. I was probably too cheap.
I'll work with that.
But I knew Charlie, and we had kept in touch. I'd sent him emails, and we had crossed paths or talked between Matt and on and off and stuff like that. But I knew the race was getting closer. May was coming up. 2 weeks prior to the race, I reach out to Matt and Charlie on an email, and I said, hey, Charlie, Matt, I know you guys are coming in for the Ironman. I would love to see if we can grab lunch or just something. I want to catch up and just say hi, and I'm going to be there to cheer you guys on for the race. P.S. I'm iron fit and ready to race if you need a guide. Within minutes, Charlie writes me back, hey, are you sure you're ready to are fit and could do an Ironman? And I said, I thought about it for a minute, and I wrote him back.
Wait, hold on.
What?
I'm not letting you get away with that.
What?
You really gave it a whole minute's worth of thought?
Actually, I called my wife. If you want to be honest, I called her and I said, hey, do you really think this is a smart move? And she looked at me, she goes, do you think you can do that? I said, well, I've run with Charlie. I know what pace he runs. I have never been on a tandem bike. I had never been tethered to another human in the water at that point in time, but I knew I was a strong swimmer. Could I do it? I think I can. But, I threw caution into the wind and basically rode him back. I did tell him at the time, I said, look, I have never been on a tandem bike before. I have never been tethered to another human being in the water at this point in time. I've run with you. You know we can run, and I'm real good at that. But I'm just giving you a heads up that, well, I'm all for
You're
this
hedging.
and do it.
You're hedging.
I'm hedging my bet to see if they would back out and go. But they were all in. And you know what? While I was scared, and the one thing about me, and the one thing I've always leveraged when guiding is, again, I go back to it's not my race. And my focus, it's really interesting. My mental state when I go into a race is that athlete. It doesn't matter what his pace is. I'm going to be there because my goal is to get him to the finish line. So I could be in the worst shape of my life, but I'm still going to be able to guide that athlete through the race he does because I literally blank out. My body doesn't matter. I don't feel the same pains or the same process that I do when I'm riding my race. I wish I could flip it a little bit because I really wish I could block that pain out when I'm running my races because I probably run a lot faster. But it really is. I was thinking about it on my run this morning, and I was like, you know what? Am I really able to run that 7:30, 7:40 pace? And I thought, well, if I'm holding this part right out here, I know when I get in a race, I'm not going to feel that.
And so I want to make sure that at some point in time, as we are recording this,
yes.
If I can take the last minute and a half of what you just said,
yeah,
and can that so that every time somebody wants to come guide or they want to know, and I'm asking because that's exactly the whole point, is as soon as the tether goes on, it's like getting in the race car. And now it's something totally different, right? You're not thinking about you in this process at all. You become an alter ego or a different human being, or even maybe not even a different human being. The process is different. The mental idea and what you're doing is different. And I think you just encapsulated in that minute and a half exactly what EyeCan tries to relate to people to help them understand that, we're not going to put you with somebody who runs the same speed you do because we need you to be able to disengage and put total focus on the athlete on the other end of that tether. And so if we can have you run a mile pace slower than your normal pace, then, most runners, all runners know when they're listening to this, oh, man, that's a pace I should be able to run all day long and not even think about it. And so that's what we do. But you did a really great job of putting that out there. And so from there now you've got that. Charlie is texting you, or y'all are emailing back and forth.
We're emailing back and forth.
And he's going like, okay, I think you're in. And this is 2 weeks out.
2 weeks out. And again, I had not been on a tandem bike. I had not been in the water with guiding another human being at that point in time. He comes in 3 days prior to the race. It is a whirlwind. I am literally, meet us out in the woodlands. We're going to fit you on the bike. I get on the bike, meet us over at the water. We're going to jump in the water real quick, and then meet us back over in Sugarland. We're going to get on the bike again. We're going to go a little bit further and learn how to start.
Yeah, and to interject, this is exactly not the way we ever want to do it.
No.
Now, it's a way that happens on occasion.
Absolutely.
Right? Because we're trying to accomplish something for this blind vision impaired person.
Right.
But that's of all the 1 to 10 scales of how 1 being how we don't want it to happen and 10 being, oh, man, this is ideal, that's a 2 or 3, right? But the need arises on occasion, and it's just how it works out.
But it goes back to people will surprise themselves as guides. You rise to the occasion of wherever you're thrown into. I mean that wholeheartedly. Like you mentioned, we try to match people up that you're a minute slower, you're running a minute slower than your normal pace, that type of stuff, which is all great. But the reality of it is when you're guiding and you get into that alter state, you can run whatever you want. You're not paying attention to you anymore. And that makes such a huge difference out there. Your knees don't hurt. Your legs don't cramp up. All these things that you normally would be thinking about in your mind, that focus shifts straight over to the athlete. And you're just running smooth because your goal at the end of the day is to get that athlete to the finish line, no matter what it takes. Sometimes it surprises you. I've run at paces with athletes that would blow me away. But I'm able to keep up because literally I'm not focused on me anymore. And that makes all the difference in the world. It goes back to what Charlie, and you mentioned, just days before this, we're getting on a bike, we're getting into the water, and we're doing this stuff. I'll never forget, we're walking up. We get to race day. I'm showing up in the morning. There's Charlie.
You get to race day, which is really only a couple of days after you're out there.
It literally is not even a day and a half. And we're getting up there at 5 o'clock in the morning. I see the bike. Matt's going, where's your water? Where's this? Again, I had never done an Ironman. Nutrition, all that type of stuff was foreign to me. And getting there with Charlie, again, my focus shifted to Charlie. I wasn't worried about me. I'll figure out me. We'll figure out what's going to happen. Get there, we load the bike, we get everything, we're setting everything up. We start the walk down to the start line. And I'll never forget.
The swim start.
And I get down there and I look at Charlie. Okay, I go, here's my process. Bathrooms, then we get this and we're walking through this type of stuff. And I'm going through this process with him. We go through, get down there. We have to give more time, right? There's two of us now. You're not focused on yourself anymore. So we're doing it. But I wanted to make sure we're at the start because one difference was in this race, because it was the inaugural year, nobody really kind of knew what was going on. And it was kind of like, let's throw it up against the wall and see if it works. They took the visually impaired and blind athletes and they put us with the pros. If you remember,
female pros,
we stepped out there in the water and it was a water start, unlike the nowadays where you kind of guide into the water and
and
just
it was
kind of
a
flows.
mass start.
It was a mass start.
Over 2,000 people.
Yes, but we weren't with the 2,000 people. We just had the women pros.
About 20. I think at that point somewhere between 20 and 30. I think.
Yeah, and it was 5 minutes between the starts, so we take off. Right? And I'm tethered to another human being at this point. I got a rope around my waist. He's got a rope around his waist. He's at my toes. He's swimming behind me at my toes. And we're going, and I feel him. I kind of describe it as, I threw a floating tire or something behind me, right? And I was going. And again, I never experienced this, so I didn't know exactly what to do. So I'm just going. I hear the gun go off behind us. For the mass start, we're talking 3,000 plus people in the water at that point, kicking and thrashing and everything else. Well, I'm ahead of them. They're much faster than we are.
What's it sound like? Do you remember what the sound of that was like in the water while you're swimming along?
Fear.
It sounds like fear.
It sounds like, well, because you all of a sudden you feel the weight come after you. We're only 5 minutes ahead of them, and the reality of it is we weren't moving real fast. So we weren't that far ahead of him. And it was crossing my mind thinking, I have a rope around my waist. He has a rope around his waist. And there's 3,000 people chasing us.
Here it comes, ladies and gentlemen.
And all of a sudden, we start feeling it. And here's what they couldn't see. They couldn't see that rope. So that when they were climbing over or through or around, that rope would get pulled. And it would get pulled in different directions. And for a minute there, it was a scary situation because, again,
how far under is this human being going to go before I go? What do we do?
Right, exactly. And the beauty of it is because Charlie had done this before, he had a sense of just keep moving forward. He knew what to do. And I kind of gathered that as we went. We stopped one time and we both looked up and he goes, just keep moving forward. just keep moving forward. So I just put my head down and I swam. And I swam as hard as I could for the entire 2.4 mile swim. We get out of the water and I'll never forget this. We're getting in the water and I'm grabbing bags and
To go into
transition.
Right.
We're going to train. We're going to change and everything else. Again, I never done triathlon with somebody else, right? A blind athlete.
You've never done triathlon. No.
Well,
Don't say it with somebody. You'd never
I had done triathlon.
Oh, that's right.
I'd done
You're
sprint.
Right.
So I understood
I didn't mean to interrupt.
I understood the transition part of things. But now I have another human being that I got to train that can't see his stuff. So being able to put his shoes out to where he can make sure my focus again moved towards him and then myself. But here's the conversation that Charlie and I had at that point. He goes, guess what? We survived the hardest part of an Ironman. And I said, you're absolutely right. You know what? We did not drown in that water. And I said it to the day after when we got all through and done with this thing. I said, I'm just so happy I didn't drown you.
Yeah, you didn't drown him, but at the same time, you didn't drown.
I didn't drown either.
And then the wild part, as you described that, is for me to, with my limited triathlon experience and being with Brandon in the water and that kind of stuff during training.
Yep.
That idea of having no visual at all, no point of reference at all, and now people are hitting your body and they're coming over the top of you or your lifeline, right? That tether is, you could tell somebody's pushing on it or yanking it, and you don't know, are you upside down? As I try and imagine it, you don't know if you're upside down or you're sideways, or did that thing just get snapped and now you're out on your own? And so the level, this is my chance to talk just a hair about just these athletes, not just Brandon, but these blind vision impaired athletes. The level of trust that they have to have and faith they have to get out there and tackle these environments and these challenges is an added testament, and I think to who they are. And I think that's probably one of the things that people get really surprised about, or they think, oh, wow, because they can't imagine closing their eyes and then doing what they barely want to do or can survive doing with all of their faculties, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it really was like an eye-opener. Keep in mind, jumping into Lake Woodlands, now there's 2 blind athletes because you really can't see in the water. So when it comes down to it, everybody's blind in that water. They can't see the rope. They can't see you. You can't see 2 feet in front of you when you're swimming in that water. So it's really kind of one of those things where you just have to go, right? And I you mentioned the strength and the trust that goes between the 2 athletes. That trust has to be throughout that entire race. And you have to have the confidence at the end of the day to know I can get him to that finish line. And that takes a lot of – and I give a lot of credit to these guides because, you're put in a situation where the potential to fail is extremely high versus you're focused on yourself normally. But now you're focused on yourself and another athlete. Like that's a lot of pressure. And being able to do that, it's absolutely incredible. So we're back in the race, right? We just got out of the water. We're going through the transition. We're learning how to, transition into a bike.
We didn't crash on the bike.
Right. How do we get there? And we get on that bike. Keep in mind, I had not gone more than maybe 2 miles on a bike on this tandem at this point. Now I'm about to go 112 miles, on open road because that first year was all the way out to Lake Livingston and back around. So it was an adventure, so to speak. And at that time, I was a fairly strong cyclist. But having somebody on the back and you're carrying that extra weight and you've got somebody doing other things, right? I mean, reaching down to grab a bottle. There's a balance issues. There's all sorts of things that you got to focus on when doing that. So, Charlie and I just took it step by step. Like we started off, he said, don't try to kill it off the bat. Let's just work our way into it. Get into a groove. And we actually got into a really good groove. It was actually interesting, and I actually enjoyed the ride. What I didn't enjoy was I mentioned it earlier, is the nutrition side. Well, my focus is all on the athlete. The focus did not fall on myself, and my nutrition wasn't quite there. So I played a lot of catch up at the end of that bike race. I was like, Charlie, we're pulling over here. I got to grab some goos. I got to grab all these things to try to get my fuel so I can finish this race. So we did that. It didn't take long, but it was one of those things. It was a learning experience, right? I mean, it's all that type of stuff. So we get into, we muscle our way through the bike. We get to the run. Keep in mind, if we all remember correctly, it was 90 plus degrees that day. It was a hot May day.
It was hot.
And
I think it's 3 loops on the run.
Yes, it was 3 loops on the run. So we get out there and we're just working our way through it. He goes, as Charlie always put it, we're not going to go. We're just going to step by step, 1 foot forward at a time, stuff like that. And it was a great race. The one thing I remember, though, this was like the big learning from me. And what I did is I said to myself before I went in that race, I want to see the face of Charlie Plasko when he crosses that finish line. I want to see his face. I mean, that was always my deal because, again, this isn't my race. This is his. And everybody in the world has always told these visually impaired and blind athletes that they can't. You've always been told you can't do this. So if you look at the picture when we're crossing the finish line, you see me looking to the left. And I'm looking at his face, and I've always maintained this, is there's nothing like seeing the face of an athlete when crossing that finish line, knowing in the back of your mind that everybody in their mom said they can't do this. That is a hold my beer, watch this moment, if I've ever heard one. And again, impossible never even comes across my mind. So with that said, I'm all in at this point, right? I've guided a triathlon. I've guided a 30K. I wanted to learn more, and at the time, that's when we became closer because I got to know Brandon, and Brandon was still training after the marathon, after the Ironman. He wanted to do other races and stuff, so we kind of got connected, and that's when I became a training buddy of Brandon for the most part.
Right. And at that point, I hadn't done any the idea when we were training from a swim standpoint, and we were going to swim. All the people in the swim class would go like, "Why don't you get in the water?" Because I was standing on the pool deck kind of guy, and I would always say, "No, I need all the focus to be on Brandon. He's the one about to go get in this water and swim 2.4 miles." And any second they're looking at me, you're looking at me and looking at my swim stroke or whatever. That's a second you're not looking at him, and he's the one that's going to go out there. But my fallback would be, and it's one of those things hung by your tongue. My fallback would be after he finishes that, then maybe I'll get in the water,
right?
Or after he finishes that, then it went from maybe to I'll start swimming after, because in some ways Brandon, in my mind, was having fun, even though it was tedious. The task of training and that kind of stuff was tedious. I could tell he was enjoying the process. All of our family was like, "Why are you torturing your kid? Right? Why are you making Brandon do this?"
Right.
And I would say Brandon spent 5 hours on the back porch with no music, no sound, no nothing, pedaling the bike for 5 hours nonstop. You can't make a human being do that if they don't want to do it.
Absolutely.
Right? So we're there and doing that. So now all of a sudden I'm saying, after the race, so then I'm going like, okay, well, I guess I'm in the pool now. And then, of course, what do you do? In the family, it was, okay, Brandon just did an Ironman.
Right.
What the heck is going on? Well, what do you do after you've done an Ironman? Your third race, your third triathlon ever happens to be Ironman.
Right.
And so it was, well, let's go see. And at that point in time, the triathlon community was in its heyday, or almost in its heyday. It was on the way up. So there were a lot of races, a lot of different things going on. And so we decided to keep pursuing that thought of doing triathlons. And so people like Justin Sternberg, Courtney Sternberg's husband,
More importantly.
Yeah, became very instrumental in helping Brandon accomplish what he said, right? We really weren't torturing the kid or forcing him to do something. You want to do this, you want to do that. There's this race, it's there, you want to do this. These were all things he would say, I'm in.
Yep.
And so then how do you go make sure you get enough swim time in and run time and bike time? And so then people like Courtney Sternberg's husband stepped up and would say, okay, I can help you on this Saturday at this time. I can meet you at this place.
Right.
And then the Adame environment became, I became Sherpa number one.
Right.
Trying to find somebody that could help Brandon get one of his 9 workouts for the week. Find somebody that could help him do that. Now, this was, well, let me digress. It really wasn't 9. It was 3 maybe or 4 because this was still a recreational thing.
Right.
Back in 2011.
Right.
We hadn't figured out accidentally and discovered that there was a worldwide opportunity
Right.
for him to participate in para-triathlon. Never even heard the name.
Right.
In para-triathlon and then compete against other blind vision impaired athletes, not just any blind, top world-class blind vision impaired athletes that Brandon's dad didn't even realize Brandon was in that category or had those such desires. So it was all a learning experience, but it all came back to somebody raising their hand and go like, hey, listen, I think he can do this, or I'm willing to do this if Brandon wants to proceed in the process.
Yep.
So you got that. You get Charlie out of the water. I even remember you did a little story the next day or two. It's about 6 or 7 minutes.
Yeah.
Where you and Charlie talked about that.
Yep.
And maybe at some point we might be able to find that and make sure we have permission and play that.
Right.
Play that again because it's always fun to reminisce. I mean,
Right.
that was more than 10 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
That was a long time ago.
It was still this century.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in
Barely.
a lot of other ways, it's the environment's totally different. Back then, people who were at the top in the world doing Kona were finishing Ironman in
over 8 hours.
They were trying to get under 9.
Yeah.
They were trying to get under 9 hours.
And now they're under 7. It's unbelievable.
It's insane.
Right.
So we come back to that investment in equipment, that has a little something to do with it.
A little carbon makes things a lot easier.
So we're doing that, and there still at this point isn't a thought from our side to EyeCan Alliance isn't even in the vision or the lexicon or the thought moving forward. At this point, it's just trying to find people to do stuff with Brandon. And it wasn't until this accidental arrival of the U.S. Paratriathlon National Championships in 2012 at Captex over Memorial Day weekend that we find that somebody lets us know that there's this race and it's the U.S. National Championships and it's in Austin.
Yep.
And so in the David Adame environment, wait, Austin, Houston, that's not that far.
Right.
I got to pay for gas. We can probably find a friend's house to stay at.
Yep.
And then we might be able to convince a guide to come guide, and that person will probably pay their own hotel, or we'd have to pay their hotel. We'd figure it out. But it was really because it just wasn't that expensive.
Right.
That we said, okay, let's go do this race. And so that really started a totally separate part of the journey.
But you gotta take a step back.
I'll be happy to.
There was you had to qualify for that race. You remember there was a learning deal. We ran the only race at Sugar Land Memorial Park ever to do it, which was the craziest thing now looking back, that we jumped into the water knowing that there's gators in that water. But that was the race that was the qualifier for Captex. And actually, there was two
Well,
races.
it wasn't a qualify. You had to hit qualifying times.
You had to hit qualifying times.
You had to hit qualifying
right.
times, but there had to be not just do a race. It had to be of a minimum distance on the run, on the swim.
Yep.
A minimum distance on the bike, and a minimum distance on the run.
Right.
Now you could have different numbers, but at a minimum in each of those,
Yep.
you had to have those things mixed in, and then overall. You had to hit. Brandon had to hit, or everybody did.
Yep.
A standard.
Yep.
In order to have the ability to qualify.
Yeah, and when we did that, it was. I believe I guided Brandon through that. Am I right on that?
I think it was year 2. I think Nigel. Actually,
No.
I remember you were year 2 that we did it. You were actually 2013. No, you guided Israel in 2013.
I guided Israel in 2013, the year before.
Nigel did the first year.
Right.
Now, here's how I remember that specifically. Now that as we're recollecting, there was a picture. Brandon finished second.
Right.
There was a picture of him right as he finished, and it ended up on the web, on the USA Paratriathlon website,
Yep.
of Nigel's hand around Brandon. Nigel looking as exhausted as Brandon looked like.
Right.
And really much gave you the feel of like a father and son
Right.
coming across. We left it all out there. Kind of thing.
Right.
It's a totally awesome picture. And you know, even now, it's been a long time, and Nigel has moved to Boulder, Colorado.
Right.
And so he probably hasn't seen Brandon maybe a few conversations over the last 7-8 years.
Right.
You know, Brandon's gone on a worldwide adventure
For sure.
since that day. But as soon as you mention Nigel to Brandon, this big grin gets on his face.
Yep.
I can remember one time Brandon, there was something here. Nigel was out of town. He came back in town. They did some simple little ride down in Sugar Land. It was like ride your bike to work day or something.
Right.
And Brandon hadn't been on the bike with Nigel for a while. And as soon as he put his leg over that seat
Yep.
and had his handlebars on, Brandon got the biggest grin on his face because he was back with his buddy.
Right.
And they were about to go for a ride.
Right.
And so, again, we come back to people like Courtney Sternberg's husband who give up time, energy, treasure to sow
Yep.
into Brandon and into the Adames. That does come back ultimately several years later of how do we pay back? It's way obvious, right? We're born, and typically our parents teach us, and the broad thought is we're going to be contributors to society, not takers from society. And so in that process, as we're thinking and we're looking at that type of thing, it's like, how do we give back? How do we make this happen? So there's a couple of 18 months, 2 years of discussion off and on in our household of whether we should start something or not, and if we did, you know, what would it look like?
Yeah.
What do we want to make sure we incorporate in the process?
Right.
And Brandon's understanding that the person who's going to lose time, and I always want to say the person who's going to miss out or who's going to not have what he had before, it's just really he's not losing. He's just getting fed or gaining in a different way.
Right.
Because as we start EyeCan Alliance, we know there's occasions and opportunities that are going to come up where time that I might normally spend with Brandon, that time has to be spent with our commitment to EyeCan Alliance or other athletes participating in a race. Or Brandon's not always going to get the best guide
Yep.
For him at that race because those needs have to go. Those resources, if you will, have to go somewhere else. So at this point now, we've done it. We've got this. You finished, and we're about to go guide Brandon in a race, and Nigel does 2012.
Yes.
And Brandon finishes second.
Right.
Dad thinks it's a fluke because 2012 is a Paralympic year.
Right.
And we figure that the guys we had met that were doing paratriathlon
Right.
were really good swimmers. We're going to the Paralympics as swimmers.
Right.
The guys who are super bikers were going to the Paralympics as bikers.
Cycling, right.
Same thing with the runners.
Yep.
So in Dad's environment, I'm figuring all the top guys aren't here because they're there.
Yep.
Or they're training to do that there. And so Brandon finished second, and that's an awesome thing.
Right.
But that's all I kind of thought about it.
Right.
Then we turn around, and here comes 2013.
Yep.
And again, this is all new. We don't know what all's happening. Don't pay that much attention. But they have the national championships. Oh, by the way, there was Captex had signed a 2-year contract.
Right.
So they had so the race was coming back to Austin again.
Right.
For a second time.
Right.
And at that point, we're involved in trying to help other athletes in the process. Yep. So Brandon has Ron Stitt as his guide for that race. And Israel Antonio is another athlete that we know. Right. That is from Chicago. Yep. I was talking slow as I'm trying to pull that name, right? Or the city. He's from Chicago, and he wants to participate, but he, as is the case, he doesn't have anybody. He doesn't have a guide, doesn't have somebody in Chicago that's working with him to train and that kind of stuff. So phone calls are made, and once again, Courtney Sternberg's husband steps up to the plate and says, "I'll guide Israel in the national championship race." Yep. And so David Adame recruited Brandon's competition. Right?
You set him up.
Recruited Brandon's competition. And so the 2013 race happens. And what is your recollection of – do you have a recollection? I'm sure you do, but what's your quick recollection of that race? I'm going to let you finish. I'm going to tell what happened. I'm not going to interrupt. Here we go.
I didn't know what to expect in that race because Israel and I had raced before. I knew going into it he was not a swimmer. Like his thing is, I'm not a good swimmer. I'm not. And at the time, the swimming was loosely regulated, I like to say, right?
I'll go with that.
Right.
That's a genteel way of phrasing it.
Right. So
they didn't know how to apply the rules.
Right. They didn't know how to apply the rules.
And not only did they not know, or maybe they knew exactly how to apply the rules, but at that point, they weren't all in. They thought the rule maybe had gone a little too far. Right. That's how I see what USA Paratriathlon and USA Triathlon, how they saw. Right. But it was all new. Brandon was a pioneer. We didn't even know at the time Brandon is a pioneer. Absolutely. He was a pioneer at that point.
Absolutely. And all of them were. I mean, when you got into that water, it was you and him. And we were going to get to that finish line however we can get to that finish line.
And you and him, it was?
Israel
and Brandon.
Yeah,
those were two totally blind guys.
Totally blind athletes.
And there was a separate division of vision impaired that had Aaron Scheides and Jeremy Winters. Right. Were those two guys. Yep. But at that point in time, they were separate divisions.
Right. Yeah. They weren't competing with them because they had some vision. And we jumped into the water, and I can remember very distinctly that Israel freaked out a little bit. Like he had a moment where he went vertical. And I grabbed him. I turned him around. I said, "Get on your back, and I want you to backstroke. Just backstroke." And I swam, and he backstroked. I could feel it because he kept on hitting me in the side with his arms, and he's backstroking going. And we get to that out of the water. And at that point, Brandon's competition, Israel, and Ron, and we all kind of got out of the water fairly close. It was a deal.
Within seconds
out of the water. So we knew it was going to be a race.
And I don't remember if Brandon was first or if Israel was first, but I want to say my mind, I'm going to give Brandon credit and say Brandon was first, but it was really, really right close. On top of each other. And I thought to myself, because we already knew Israel was a substantially faster runner than Brandon.
For sure.
And I thought to myself, there needs to be a bike crash.
For sure. I Well, Ron Stent and I both look at each other, and still to this day, we looked at each other in the water, who's going to win this race, and me and him kind of eyeballed each other, and we get out of the water, we get onto the bike. Remember, Austin's really hilly. And we there was some climbs on that race, and we were flying. We get to the end of that hill. I remember it was a downhill. We were just flying down, and I can remember very distinctly Ron and Brandon going up the hill as we had already made the turn going downhill. So we knew we were ahead of them at that point. We get down to that hill, and knowing that Israel was a very good runner, like I worried running with Israel at times because he could run at my pace. And we get to the run, we get our shoes on, we're going, and I'll never forget, I can hear Ron yelling, Brandon, Israel's 50 yards in front of us, you got to go. And we're running, and I was telling Israel the same thing. I said, hey, he's climbing on you a little bit. And there's two pictures of Israel and I going across the bridge in Austin, and it is a magical shot, as I always put it. It's me and him are step for step. You look at us, our feet are matching. We're in sequence and everything else. And we come around the corner to the deal, and I see Brandon and Ron one more time, and I go, if you keep going, we're going to win this race. And we turn.
U.S. Paratriathlon National Championships.
And we turn, there's a curb that you have to go up. And it had a ramp, but it was an extremely short ramp. It was just enough to.
Hold on, I'm going to stop you there.
Go
Don't lose your train of thought. It wasn't a ramp. They put a 1x8.
There you go. That's what it was.
And angled it.
Yes.
So that there was not a hard curb. It really wasn't a ramp. It was just a single board.
Right.
So that there wasn't a hard curb to hit. So you wouldn't stumble at the curb.
Right.
You'd stumble 2 or 3 feet and then fall because you hit
the
curb.
And I can remember because it was a hard right turn. I grabbed Israel with my right arm on his back of his.
Wait, you touch the athlete? Isn't that illegal?
No, it's not illegal.
Okay.
Not when you're turning. I grabbed his and I said, lift your feet. And he looked at me and goes, he gave me this look. Like it was like, what do you mean? And he hit the top of it. And he tripped forward a little bit, and we go. And I said, finish line is 20 yards in front of us. You're on grass. And he took off on me. We're on a tether that is fully stretched out. He's got his hands in the air. He's got this big old smile on his face. And there's me going, I need him to finish in front of me. But I think he's going to run into something. Like I was literally holding him back to finish. But again, I always go back to that smile on the face, that look on somebody's face when they accomplish something they can't do. I mean, it really just chokes me up every time because you said this is impossible. A guy that was scared to get in the water 6 months earlier now just won the national championships in the triathlon, and he jumped into Ladybird Lake in Austin, which is, let me just put it this way, it's gross. I mean, nobody should be swimming in that thing. And he did it. And then Brandon came in right afterward. That launched us. If you think about it, that race in general launched both Israel and Brandon, but it also launched like this road to some amazing opportunities in para triathlon for both Israel and Brandon and Aaron Scheides and Barbara. And I mean, the list goes on and on. I can go out and name all these athletes that got to do things, again, that most people say they will never get to do that. But, I mean, Brandon went to Brazil.
And it's one thing, and not where most people would think they don't get to do that. Most people didn't know the opportunity existed.
Exactly. And ultimately, that's where I love the fact that EyeCan and this mission to bring athletes the opportunity to be able to do these things, because it wouldn't exist if you didn't have organizations like EyeCan and I don't know the Dare to Try up in Chicago. There's organizations that basically have brought together
in Carolinas.
Yeah, and they brought together the opportunity, visual people with athletes, guides, in all aspects, whether you're missing a limb or you're missing an arm or you're missing your sight. They brought all these great people together to be able to support and make dreams come true. And that's ultimately what keeps me running. If my knees would tell you it's time to give up at this point. But honestly, I love it too much. Like, I mean, Courtney always tells me that I'm not pushing you in a wheelchair, and I said, well,
she's letting you know.
She's letting me know. And I tell her, I go, the good news is, as long as I keep going, it won't stop. If I stop, I worry more that it'll do it. And being able, this opportunity to be able to help others realize their dreams, that's what keeps me fired up. I mean, I've done it. I've run Boston. I've run the Ironman. I've done all this stuff. I've kind of hit that peak to where it's like, what else is new unless I want to go just destroy myself?
Well, Justin, I really appreciate you taking the time to come out and share this. I learned a couple of things today. Of course, the wild part is we have these opportunities. You've spent a lot of time with the Adames and with Brandon, but we're always on a mission or a focus of that day or something moving forward, and we almost never have the time to sit back and revisit.
Yes.
And then at the same time can blend all the different pieces of the story, right? We've got the puzzle pieces that, just like anything else, we got the outline put together, but man, how does this stuff fit in the middle and fill out the picture? We got some of those puzzle pieces today. So thanks again for being Justin Sternberg and taking the time to share and give to the podcast that we're doing today and we're developing, so that we can help get the word out that we exist and organizations exist in order to provide opportunities for blind, vision impaired individuals to get involved in athletics, whatever that may be.
Right.
Whether it be running or cycling or biking or walking up mountain trails or sailing, long distance swimming. I mean, even that, I think, I don't know that I'd be into long distance swimming. But thanks again, and have a great day.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you to Justin and all the other guides and EyeCan Alliance support people and partners that have given their time, effort, and love. EyeCan's gratitude for their commitment to provide these opportunities for the athletes that previously didn't exist cannot be overstated. Please like, subscribe to, and share this podcast. Also visit EyeCanAlliance.org to learn more about its history and how you can get involved. Thank you.